Next, we have Charlie Hertzog Young, who is a researcher, writer, and award-winning activist. He's worked for it's a long list. The New Economics Foundation, the Royal Society of Arts, the Good Law Project, the 4-Day Week campaign, and the Centre for Progressive Change, as well as the UK Labour Party under 3 consecutive leaders. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks to the Photographers Gallery for hosting this. I tend to mumble, so anyone just shout if you can't hear me, please. I'm an activist, researcher, and author, and I've been involved in climate activism since my early teens, so more than half my life. And being that close to climate Armageddon for that long has had a massive deleterious effect on my mental health. And I lost my legs as a result of a climate-related mental health issue over years. And since that happened, just before COVID, I've been involved in a lot of different modes of recovery, and one of the most important was collaborative, emergent activism with people all over the world who are at the nexus of climate change and mental health. And one of the outcomes of that, shameless plug, is that I wrote a book that came out recently. It's called Spinning Out, Climate Change, Mental Health and Fighting for a Better Future. And if you find any of what I say today intriguing, I'd be honored if you'd pick up a copy. Context, I'm in a lot of pain right now, and I've barely slept for over a month, and I've got major surgery on my leg on Tuesday. So I decided to write my speech down. I hope that doesn't detract from how it lands with any of you, but I promise it's not done out of laziness. It's just a coping strategy that means I can be here with you, and I'm very happy that I can. So, thank you. Hold that, Alice. Thanks, that was my original plan. So, as the climate heats up, the world is talking more and more about climate change and mental health. People usually call this eco-anxiety. Whatever we choose to call it, it's helpful to think about eco-anxiety as the tip of a rapidly melting iceberg. Climate change is causing immense mental distress. This goes far beyond worrying about nature. The climate's impact on the mind is costing people their livelihoods and their lives. Some of it we can see, almost all of it is invisibilized. I think it's good that we're doing this in front of these photographs because this is real, deep stuff. The fear of environmental doom is potent. People are developing mood disorders, anxiety, PTSD, psychosis, eating disorders, and more, all linked to climate change. Notably, and alarmingly, 2 men set themselves on fire in the US recently. A young man in Australia refused to drink water and was admitted to a psych ward because he believed that if he drank, millions of people would die of dehydration. In the UK, young people are not sleeping, eating, or working because of fears of environmental apocalypse. Some medics call this disabling. It's generally understood that the material lives of people living in the global south will be hardest hit by climate change, but the psychological impact is yet to be properly acknowledged. It's much greater and it's qualitatively different than what we're talking about in the global north. But even when we try to understand it, it's largely obscured by the metrics we use, things richer countries deem important, and where they exist, the treatments on offer. Floods, heat waves, migrations, and more are creating rocketing levels of climate trauma, resulting in untold suffering. People are left with PTSD, prolonged grief, disabling anxiety disorders, and more. This mental precariousness can last lifetimes. Most people get next to no psychological support, even less than they would have done prior to climate shocks, as land bases and infrastructure buckle, communities disintegrate, and health systems collapse. The fear of climate chaos getting worse is in itself a massive destabilizing force. Precariousness piled on top of precariousness. Globally, oh, I thought the rubbish truck was back. Globally, according to one study of 10,000 young people, 58% of people think that humanity is doomed, and you can see why. It's hard to get to grips with any of this without going a little deeper. We don't understand the mind. Most, including psychiatrists, especially psychiatrists, still lean on the idea that mental health issues are biological glitches or chemical imbalances, things that can be fixed with some intervention. That model, the biomedical model, is outdated and dangerous. We might be primed for certain mental health conditions by our family history, our neurochemistry, and things like nutrition or lack of exercise, but it's like stacking a deck of cards. None of us are hardwired to be depressed, just like no one is destined to be happy. Climate change makes the whole game harder. How we exist in the world, socially, ecologically, and ideologically, and what is done to us, are far more important, powerful causes of mental health issues. They're also much more important in recovery. There are no quick fixes for mental health or climate change. We have to act systemically. It's a word that's thrown around a lot, but it really means something in terms of systems theory. That is a route to personal and planetary healing. It's also a route to bringing new worlds into being. Let's look deeper down the eco-anxiety glacier for a moment, starting with the social, then the ecological, and finally the ideological. So, the social. Poverty is a massive driver of mental health issues, and climate change is making things worse. Not having enough to eat, being really cold or really hot, not having stable housing. People don't get depressed in these situations because they're weak. It's because they're tipped over an edge by the world around them. It's no coincidence that the poorest 20% of people in the UK are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop serious mental health issues. The climate is very likely to increase inequality too, within and between countries. Inequality makes us all worse off mentally, largely because of status anxiety and the degradation of social life, belonging, and trust. A layer down, we have ecology. First, there's the connection between ecology and material subsistence. 60,000 farmers, in fact more than 60,000 farmers in India, have died by suicide, specifically linked to climate-induced crop failures. Natural disasters can lead to 40 times as many mental health diagnoses as physical ones. Climate's connections to conflict are similarly dangerous, especially given migrants are some of the most at risk of mental health issues and the least likely to get support, which is very true in the UK. In cities, many of us already suffer from what some scholars call species loneliness. Nearly everything we see is human, or made by humans, or altered by humans. This affects our bodies and our minds in ways that modern science is only just beginning to pay attention to. For those living in closer relationship with the Earth, a loss of ecosystem can be experienced as the death of a loved one. Some Indigenous peoples have been living out the violent theft and loss of landscapes as grief and mourning for centuries. Planetary dysregulation in general, and the climate crisis in particular, are kicking this into a new phase. In fact, it already has. The very fact that people in the global north are struggling with mental health issues because of global environmental degradation at such a distance should sound alarm bells. First, because it's not important until the relatively privileged, myself included, get hit by this stuff. Second, because if it's already percolated all the way through the layers and layers of insulation wrapped around us by civilization, then something must be deeply fundamentally wrong. This takes us to ideology and imagination. I promise you this is an academic wank, it's really important. Ideology decides what counts as truth, what our purpose is as individuals and nations, our place in society and our place in nature. We've got individualism, sure. We've also got new iterations of neoliberalism, colonialism, and extractivism. All of these legitimize the dominant culture and propel it into new destructive terrains. Undergirding these are ways of thinking and justifying power while keeping alternatives at bay. The Western biomedical epistemology, along with our obsession with quantitative methods for establishing valid truth, depend on dissecting the world into smaller and smaller units, breaking up the mind and the universe into discrete pieces of different validity and worth. This makes the totality, the interconnectedness, impossible to see. It erases what it can't measure. When I last looked, 90% of the world's countries did not have a climate-related mental health plan. The World Health Organization estimates that a quarter of people who live through a natural disaster will develop PTSS, depression, or anxiety. The 10% of nations with a climate mental health plan were almost all focused on having more psychiatrists and more medication. That's an individualizing chemical response to a planet that is being pulled apart. Someone I worked with for the book, Dr. Asma Humayun, has a different approach. When we spoke last year, floodwater was covering a third of her country, Pakistan. Dr. Humayun's mental health and psychosocial support, MHPSS, model is about rapidly building capacity rooted in connection. Her team trained 1,000 volunteers in psychological first aid in a month. Connected through a low bandwidth app, these were people with high social contact who learn from individuals and groups in the community, referring people to more specialized support if needed, mutually educating each other and building communities of care. With very little money and infrastructure, this leads to a dense web of meaningful, reliable support that is consistently evolving. Self-referral rates and recovery is astonishing. The most recent pilot covered an area of 1 million people. Prior to the pilot, everyone was apparently treated by a single psychiatrist, which is a hangover of British colonialism in Pakistan. With climate shocks ripping across the world, just airdropping in pharmaceuticals and psychiatrists isn't going to cut it. Disconnection and domination got us here. Reconnection and equity will set us free. Finally, madness, eco-anxiety or otherwise, is not an error in the computer circuitry of our brains. It's the mind's complex response to living in a broken world. It's completely understandable that the climate is driving so many of us mad. But it's something we can learn from if we listen. There are strategies, insights, and tools in madness that can help guide us out of this mess. Psychosis may, according to some scholars, be an evolutionary adaptation that helps us scout ahead for meaning in uncertain times. Depression can strip things back to a bleak but pragmatic objectivity, and anxiety can protect us from real dangers that others cannot see. Living with serious mental health issues can also give us coping strategies that are good for movement, good for exploring alternative futures, and good for learning how to look after each other, which is something that this culture is very bad at. Deep suffering can teach deep empathy, revolutionary patience, and strategy. Upending this eco-anxiety glacier, turning it on its head and exposing the ideologies and imaginaries underneath is a huge task. But looking hard, as many have done for generations, and learning different ways of being and changing our priorities individually and, this is important, collectively, can help us heal ourselves. We need to find our best fit in this scary, exhilarating moment of profound shift and uncertainty. We have to take back control of our imaginations. We need to find people we can trust to do good, joyous work with. I've personally found that as healing as any therapy. The implications are revolutionary. For some, held right, a breakdown can be a breakthrough. Perhaps that can be true for a civilization. Our climate system is breaking apart. Our minds are cracking open. We need to use them as openings to other worlds and fuel for dismantling a machine that is killing us. Thank you.